Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I am Charmaine Dean. I'm the Vice President of Research and International at the University of Waterloo. Very glad to have you all here for this important panel discussion. Before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge, on behalf of the University of Waterloo, that we live and work on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The University of Waterloo is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River. It's such a pleasure to have you here today at our November Research Talks series. On behalf of the office, I'd like to thank you all for your participation in today's very interesting panel presentation. Today's session is entitled A Calm Front, Climate Resilience, and you know that the whole climate issues have become very prominent as part of for example, the federal election rollout. There was a lot of discussion about climate and climate resilience and climate issues, and we expect that this is going to be front of mind for not just the people of Canada, but for the federal government and provincial governments as we move forward. So this is a very timely session for us today. Tell you a little bit about how we're going to roll the session out. We have 4 speakers. 3 of them are here right now, and I'm going to introduce all 4 of them at the start. The 4th is at another event and will be here shortly, hopefully in time for when she has to give her presentation. And it looks like she's unable to join us today. The preliminary event is actually running very, very late. So we have 3 speakers here today. I will introduce each of the 3 speakers. You'll get a chance to see them. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have each of them give a brief presentation on the topic of the discussion today. Following that presentation, we're going to invite them to the front, and the majority of the session then will be engagement with you on a question and answer and discussion period. So let me tell you a little bit about our distinguished guests. Katherine Backus is the Director of Climate Finance and Science at Waterloo's Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. She has a strong background in finance and insurance, and she assesses the impact of climate change on specific industry sectors and capital markets. She helps investment professionals integrate climate change and extreme weather conditions into forward-looking portfolio analysis in order to minimize risk. She developed a framework for integrating environmental, social, and corporate governance factors into investment portfolios and has led climate-related business analysis and platform development across Canada and also across the United States. She received a bachelor's degree in biological science with a specialization in environmental science from the University of Toronto. She holds several financial designations, including the Canadian Securities course. Thank you very much, Katherine, for being here. Rebecca Sari is an assistant professor, civil and environmental engineering, and a professional air quality engineer. Rebecca's research explores the consequences of climate change and climate policy on human health and environmental inequality. She has developed integrated assessment models to evaluate the impacts of sustainable infrastructure, including policies on energy, buildings, and transportation. She has many years of postgraduate experience in air pollution, air quality modeling. She's completed several climate-related projects in 7 provinces and territories. She directly informs policy, so she translates her research into knowledge and policy through invited presentations to policymakers, through engagement with policymakers, and her work has therefore been covered by very many news media, including the CBC, the NBC, the New York Times. Rebecca received a PhD in engineering systems from MIT a Master's of Applied Science, Mechanical and Environmental Engineering, and a Bachelor's of Applied Science, Engineering Science from the University of Toronto. Thank you for being here, Rebecca. Peter Johnson is Director of Environment and Social Risk and Opportunity at Scotiabank Global Risk Management. Peter is a recognized leader in corporate responsibility and has worked across many sectors, developing and implementing business-centric programs around sustainability, around climate change, and risk management. At Scotiabank, he is responsible for identifying and managing current and emerging environmental, social, and sustainability risks and opportunities across Scotiabank's country operational footprint. Peter has worked in similar roles at TD Bank Group and PricewaterhouseCoopers, so he's developed expertise across a broad sector of banks and investment portfolios, and was the first certified sustainable forest management auditor in North America. He received a master's degree in forestry from Lakehead University and a bachelor's degree in forestry from the University of Toronto. At this point, I'd like to thank all our speakers for being here today. Please join me in thanking them all. So, as I said earlier, to begin, we're going to invite each of the panelists, starting with Katherine, to give a presentation. The presentations will roll through speaker by speaker, and then you will have an opportunity to engage with them after the presentations.
Thank you, Charmaine. Can everyone hear me okay? As Charmaine said, my name is Katherine Backus, and I am Director, Climate Finance and Science at the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. For those of you unfamiliar with the Intact Center, we are an applied research center here at the University of Waterloo that helps homeowners, communities, governments, and businesses reduce risk associated with climate change and extreme weather events. We focus on flooding, fire, extreme heat, and my personal domain of engaging institutional investors, so more specifically those who invest things like pension funds, to determine how performance of companies and ultimately stock price and returns can be affected by climate change. So I am going to discuss the financial and social costs of extreme weather and how they are increasing, which industry sectors are impacted by climate change, how we're taking all of that and factoring climate risk into institutional portfolio management. I'm going to wrap it all up and try to do that in 10 minutes. So I'm going to get to it right now. How do we make the correlation between climate change and financial valuation? First, we must look at the financial costs associated with extreme weather. And there is no better indicator than the property and casualty, the P&C insurance sector, where fire, flood, wind, and their impacts can be calculated almost instantaneously. The image here displays annual catastrophic losses throughout Canada. CAT losses are any extreme event, flood, fire, wind, that triggers more than $25 million of losses within a specific event. As you can see along the axis, we have time. So as of 1983 to 2008, which is just before the block here, you had an average catastrophic losses of $250 to $450 million per year for extreme weather events. The green box now shows you that between 2009 and 2018, losses are ranging from $1.8 billion per year. The last 9 out of 10 of the last years have been above $1 billion. The losses represented here are corrected for inflation and per capita wealth accumulation. So we are looking at apples to apples. So it is a comparison of apples to apples throughout the years. These are insurable losses, but take this graph and multiply it by 3 or 4 times. That is uninsurable losses borne to individuals and governments. So that's money coming out of pocket, or more specifically for governments, more money coming out of our pockets as taxpayers. Specifically for government, the money that is put towards these losses is money being taken away from hospitals, schools, and infrastructure development. So we need to understand the socioeconomic impacts that are happening because of climate change. Insurance is just one industry, but this image is a metaphor for the risk manifesting itself within our economic system. As the impacts of climate change increase, the costs of climate change also increase with it. According to Bloomberg, the impact of extreme weather is not going to be restricted to one business. So the P&C sector should be viewed as a proxy for the growing costs of climate change that will impact, to varying degrees, most, if not all, industry sectors. But how do we know that climate change is actually impacting industry sectors? 5 billion here, 3 billion there, 1 billion, 8 million. The most costly disaster ever, 230,000 without power, 11,000 killed. Mining, forestry, agriculture, commercial real estate, utilities, fisheries, automotive, banking, and many more impacted industry sectors. These are headlines that bombard us every day. So the physical climate risk that will and have already impacted industry sectors will continue to impact companies as companies suffer disruptions to the continuity of their business operations. When these disruptions are material, so for example, if a flooding event happens, truncates a supply chain, that will ultimately impact future cash flows. This is there's fiduciary duty there on the standpoint of the company, acting in interest of another involved party. So it would be required that this information be disclosed because these things will affect the decision of an investor to buy, hold, or sell that specific company. The fiduciary logic makes sense. But most industry sectors are not disclosing climate-related impacts to investors. So this is coming from the Bank of Canada. Institutional investors are dissatisfied with the state of corporate climate-related reporting in Canada. You can read the rest, but basically it's saying that despite growing empirical evidence, investors still do not have investment tools or best practices to follow. So that's where I come in. The primary purpose of mine and my colleagues' research is to present a protocol and framework that, if applied across industry sectors, will alleviate the dissatisfaction felt by institutional investors regarding climate risk reporting. So this report is going to be released at the beginning of December. We're working with the Global Risk Institute, Scotiabank, and I am actually working with Peter, so it's great to see Peter. And we have developed a framework which is globally scalable across all industry sectors, and that we have dubbed the Climate Risk Matrix. The Climate Risk Matrix prioritizes 1 to 2 means by which extreme weather, so flood, fire, wind, could negatively impact the operations of a company within a given sector. The Climate Risk Matrices also identify actions that an investor should expect a company to take to mitigate against these risks. Now, we've only completed 2 industry sectors climate risk matrices for the electricity transmission and distribution and commercial real estate. We do have plans to complete 2 more in the near future. But so far, as an example, electricity and transmission, the 2 most risky impacts to the business operations are actually wind and ice loading. These factors need to be integrated into decision making. Because if I'm an investment analyst and I have 2 companies in front of me, one who's disclosing risk and one who is actively trying to mitigate risk, while the other is not, I'm going to err on the side of caution and go with mitigation and those who are adapting and disclosing their risk. Financial analysts, that's never going to be that simple. But what this offers is a 2-sided opportunity for, one, portfolio managers are not all experts in every industry sector. So the Climate Risk Matrix offers them an opportunity to start asking the right questions of industry sectors. 2, if companies are unable to answer these questions, so if they have not disclosed, it will be the institutional investors who are going to be driving change and putting pressure on these corporations, as well as the securities commissions and credit rating agencies to ensure disclosure. It must be identified that incorporating climate risk into financial valuation is adaptive management that will limit beta, or AKA risk. So once we've identified the climate risk and created these climate risk matrices, The next question to consider from a perspective of financial valuation is, can these physical risks be translated into financial valuation? And the answer is yes, it can be. Utilizing such tools as ratio analysis, discounted cash flow, and economic value add, which we have done in this report, we are able to take the disclosed climate-related information and translate that to impact on share price. I found disclosed information for a publicly traded electricity company out of Alberta, and they stated that if they had 1% decline in their energy distribution, that would be $12 million impact on their business. Now, that 1 to 12 ratio is not what's important. If you use these financial valuations and calculate the impact on share price, you're looking on average a 10 to 13% impact to share price, which is quite material. Climate change has happened. Climate change is happening, and it will continue to happen. The good news is that capital markets, credit rating agencies, securities commissions, and board of directors are all recognizing that climate change is a real problem. And that's something that didn't happen before. Speaking from experience, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, people would not agree to this. So the fact that people are on board, this is very positive. According to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, there is no doubt that climate change and extreme weather risk should factor into business valuation. The Intact Centre has mobilized on our mandate through the development of climate risk matrices, and we offer a practical, accessible, user-friendly method to incorporate physical climate risk into institutional portfolio management. Thank you.
So I'm here to talk about, we just heard about some financial risks to the private sector industry primarily. When I think climate resilience, I think about our biggest budget line in the public sector spending here in Ontario, which is healthcare, totaling about $60 billion annually. And so when I think about climate resilience, I think about resilient health systems because climate change is thought to be the biggest risk to public health for this century. How does climate change affect human health? Well, all of these various physical changes in the climate system affect exposures, access to nutrition, security, livability of conditions around us, and all of that affects various health outcomes. One of which I focus on in particular, which is air pollution, and I will tell you why. Well, partly it's because I like to be an optimist, and I see climate solutions as an opportunity to improve our health because it happens a low-carbon diet is a healthier diet, and active transportation is low carbon and healthy. And if we combat climate change, we'll also reduce our exposure to air pollution. And these are the sorts of benefits that we can experience locally and more immediately. And again, I will focus on air pollution. So why air pollution? Here's why. These are the results of the Global Burden of Disease study. So this tracks premature deaths worldwide, which you can see here on the x-axis. These are in millions of premature deaths annually. And they rank the risk factors. And if you go down the list, you can see all the usual suspects, right? High blood pressure, smoking, high blood sugar, high body mass index, high cholesterol, and then air pollution, which makes air pollution the leading environmental risk factor contributing to premature death worldwide to the order of about 4 to 8 million deaths worldwide annually. And those deaths are associated with increased risk to various health outcomes, things like lung cancer, heart disease, respiratory illness. And those illnesses and deaths have significant economic impacts. It contributes to lost worker productivity, lost income, increased healthcare spending, and generally decreased well-being to the tune in Canada of air quality impacts valued at $50 billion annually. So how does this problem come about and how does it relate to climate change? Well, air pollution comes from us doing lots of useful stuff. Driving to work, building the roads we drive to work on, heating our houses. And that results in emissions of air pollutants, which in the atmosphere form poor air quality that contributes to human health impacts. But the formation of those pollutants in the air depend on what's going on with the climate system, and those pollutants also affect what's going on in the climate system. So we have a feedback here that will ultimately affect our health and affect our exposures to air pollution. If we look at climate change, we have a very similar situation where many of those same activities that release emissions of air pollutants also release greenhouse gases that ultimately affect the energy balance of the Earth, which heats the planet, causes climate change, and results in health impacts across all those various categories I mentioned, including air pollution. Okay? So these two problems are intimately and inextricably linked. Air pollution, which is currently the leading environmental public health challenge, and climate change, which is going to be the leading environmental public health challenge of this century. So climate policy, for example, will affect these sources of air pollutant emissions, which will affect air pollution, which will affect human health. Climate policy will also directly affect greenhouse gas emissions, at least we hope that's the point, which will affect climate change, which will affect air pollution, which will affect human health. So there are these two main pathways through which action or inaction on climate change will affect the health impacts of air pollution. So our challenge then is to look at these emitting activities and understand the costs and options for altering them in consideration of the potential benefits that we would gain. And so the focus of my work particularly is in quantifying those benefits as they relate to air quality. And the way we do that is through developing integrated modeling systems that represent the effects of policy on different emitting activities, how those activities affect air quality, and how air quality yields health and economic impacts. Okay? So with the rest of my time, I'm going to highlight a few of our studies in this area and what we can learn from those about building resilient health systems under climate change. And the focus of this panel was on resilience, I think, more to extreme events. And the vernacular that has arisen for extreme events when it comes to air pollution is airpocalypse. And so you might remember the recent airpocalypse that occurred in India, which results in public health emergencies. And folks have studied these events and do find that under changing climate, that they tend to, these extreme type events become more frequent, but also generally climate change exacerbates air pollution and its resulting public health burden. So we've done some work on this, just looking at the way that climate change will affect pollutant formation, and found that by the end of this century in the US, that would result in an extra tens of thousands of premature deaths each year, thousands of extra heart attacks, millions of extra lost work days. And to the extent that it would erase half of the gains from the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. However, those are the black bars. If we do adopt policy that's consistent with our global climate agreements, then we can nearly erase all that additional risk. And that has huge implications for the economy. So here we're looking at the design of a climate policy where we have a specific reduction target in mind. And we are saying, first of all, let's let anybody, wherever it's most cost effective, the whole economy can meet to work together to reduce this target. Then we say, okay, now just the electricity sector, you have to be responsible for that whole target. Or transportation sector, you have responsibility for that whole target. And then we do something very unfair. We compare the entire cost of the climate policy per capita to just the air quality related health co-benefit. just this one tiny benefit that we would get from enacting a climate policy. And what we find is, regardless of the policy design, we have significant air quality co-benefits. But what changes a lot is the cost. And the more we encourage cooperation across sectors, the more the costs go down, till we reach a point where the air quality co-benefits alone can pay for that climate policy up to 10 times. Now, here in Ontario, we have our largest contributor to greenhouse gases is currently the transportation sector. So we have maybe a bit of a challenge here in reducing further, but our work is showing that if we include these air quality co-benefits, that we can inform decisions to decarbonize our infrastructure and also incentivize low carbon transportation. One last point, and this is on not sectoral cooperation, but interjurisdictional cooperation, because the reality is here in North America that we have national goals, but different disparate subnational policies. And so we asked, what happens if we all work together to meet one national goal? And what we find are significant savings in terms of the cost of meeting that goal. And also, we happen to shift pollution to areas where it's less damaging. And so we have a win-win here. So these are just a few highlights of different studies from a body of work that generally shows we have a good news story that if we design cost-effective climate policy, air quality co-benefits could be so significant as to completely exceed the costs of that policy. And so if we design policies that encourage cooperation across sectors and jurisdictions, then we can yield significant benefits to help us address the risks of climate change. And that's my time, and I'll be happy to chat with you after the panel.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to meet with you this morning. You may be a little bit confused by that introduction in the biography about what is a forester doing here talking about banking and climate change. Well, let me explain. So, as noted in the introduction, my background is in the natural resources, in the natural resource sector. And when I started out my career, I thought for sure I was going to be staying in that sector. But as we know, life has some changes, some planned, some unexpected. And so I found myself asked to join PwC Consulting about 15 years ago and started up their sustainability practice for consulting with companies around sustainability. Back when carbon was in vogue the first time, around 2007, 2008, when there was going to be a price on carbon. We had the Montreal Carbon Exchange, we had the Chicago Exchange, and then we had a financial crisis, and the whole thing fell apart. And here we are, 2017, 2018, 2019, and carbon is back in. And climate change is back in, and it's the topic of the day. And it will be for the very, very long time, because this time it's embedded and is becoming embedded in our financial factors and across society overall. So I moved from PricewaterhouseCoopers, I went to TD Bank, and 5 years ago I moved across the street, literally, and now work at Scotiabank. I work in our risk team. I report up to the Chief Risk Officer of the bank, and my day-to-day job is to develop and implement the policies that the bank uses for assessing the environmental and social risks for who we lend to. And we can talk more about that, I'm sure, during the Q&A session. I was struggling to how to approach this presentation because there's many different angles that we can take on this. Climate change, as we know, is a very, very diverse topic. So I'm going to take you down a road around where the global markets are going around this topic, and in particular, the Canadian markets. Because we know that climate change is a problem, but now we need to start to think about the solutions and how it is that the financial community is coming around to address some of these solutions. And let me start with the topic of risk, because climate change really is just another form of risk. And I'll explain the CSA logo in a minute as well. So climate change is a risk. So you take a bank like Scotiabank. Scotiabank has been around for 187 years. We can trace our roots even further than that. We have a precious metal group, Scotia Makata, which was founded in the 1640s in the UK. And that's our precious metals trading group, still based out of the UK. And banks, for the most part, are risk managers. And they base their financial lending on all kinds of risk. And the risks that are out there and the risk awareness is very important, but we also need to take into consideration that there are a lot of different types of risks out there. There's cyber risk, which is a huge issue and challenge right now. There's market risk, there's foreign exchange risk, there's political risk, there's geographical risk, there's liquidity risk, there's all kinds of risks that banks and financial institutions have to manage. So the first order of business was, how do we get the banks and the financial community to get climate change risk onto their agenda? Well, certainly you do what we did at Scotiabank and you really start to research and you discuss it and you work your way up the chain. All the other Canadian banks and global banks have done that as well. You have some precedent-setting reports that get put out globally. The Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, was really one of those pivotal reports. The author and mastermind behind it, former Bank of Canada Chairman Mark Carney, now the bank chairman for the UK. We'll see where he's going to end up in January when he's finished his tenure. But he was the mastermind, and he's a bit of our rock star when it comes to financial markets and climate change. And so that started to get banks to start to talk about the types of risks associated with their lending portfolio and more about risk disclosure that we heard about earlier from Kathy, about the, from the disclosure and how people are talking about there. Huge amount of work still has to be done on that, but that is at least starting to get into conversations. And then risk management itself. So how do companies, how do banks manage the risks associated with their lending? So for Scotiabank, we've just released a climate change risk due diligence process. So we do a physical and transition risk assessment for every non-retail loan. So a retail loan is something that you would get for your personal credit card or your mortgage or your savings account. So all the other types of commerce that goes on is the non-retail. And so we've just introduced and have rolled out a climate change risk assessment at that level, which is very, very fundamental and is really starting to raise that conversation in day-to-day banking with our clients. And it's happening across Canada as well. So we then can move then to all this risk and all the problems, and it sounds kind of dour and down. But the bottom part is probably the really exciting and interesting piece, and that's around the mobilization of global capital. And that's what I decided to focus this presentation on. Because there's tremendous amounts of science about the statistics about the impacts of climate change. I think, aside from a few rogue people who want to deny it, I think the writing is on the wall very crystal clear about climate change. But now we got to start to mobilize capital, and we got to start thinking about how is it that we are going to move ahead. And the context behind this, if you haven't heard about the expert panel for sustainable finance, it is a must read. I would say pretty much regardless of what faculty or discipline or school that you're in. And there were 4 experts from Canada that went around the country for a year and tried to figure out recommendations for how it is that we can move this concept of sustainable finance or green finance into just finance. We don't need to call it something different. We need to call it something that's practical and something that is day-to-day. And so this report gives very, very good, helpful, insightful recommendations that make sense and they're logical. Some are the responsibility of governments, some are the responsibility of the markets, some are the responsibilities of universities and institutions and research organizations, but it really is this call to action about moving sustainable finance into just plain finance. So one of the recommendations is around developing what we call a taxonomy, because if you want to mobilize global capital, you need to mobilize it into the right places in order to address climate change. And so we already know that there's a lot of capital that's flowing into renewable types of projects and green energy and those types of things. But one of the things that's missing is what they call the transition segment. And these are the companies, the processes, the organizations that are perhaps not as green as they need to be, but they are on their way. So I'll give you a very practical example. If you have a power generation facility that historically has burned oil or has burned coal, and they switch that over to natural gas, which is a lower emitting fuel, that's a transition. And ultimately, that will make that move hopefully to either close down or move into renewable energy. And that's critically important in Canada because we as a country have been historically and currently are very, very dependent on our natural resource sector. So this may sound like a roundabout story, and where's this guy going with resiliency? But let me explain to you what we're doing in Canada, and resiliency is going to come in as a key piece to this in just a minute. So the need that we have in Canada is that we need a made-in-Canada definition of what constitutes green and what constitutes transition within finance. And they do this by a taxonomy, and taxonomy is really a list of activities. These are the things that we would consider as being green. These are the things that we would consider as being transition. And why do we need this? Well, we need this because the existing and the proposed taxonomy around green finance and transition, they're not appropriate to the Canadian context, given our natural resources. So the EU has produced or has drafted the European taxonomy, the EU taxonomy that people really reference and refer to. And you know what? It's great if you are a service-based economy. Basically, Western Europe has outsourced all of their natural resource use for centuries. If you think about why and how Canada was established, we were a natural resource warehouse for Western Europe, particularly the French and the British. They needed minerals, we had minerals. They need fish, we have fish. They need timber, we got a lot of timber. You know, they need bear furs for their nice big hats, we got bear furs for the nice big hats. So we were created for our natural resources. And based on those natural resources, we built a country, a tremendous country, and our infrastructure. Those natural resources built our highways, our schools, our hospitals, our communities, and they are an essential part of our economy still. So we have to appreciate and understand that we're a natural resource-based country, yet the taxonomies that are in existence in the world right now don't recognize those natural resource-based economies. So in Canada, we have come together, and I mean we, I'll talk about who's part of this in just a few minutes, but we need to have three objectives. We have to create a green and transition taxonomy for Canada that's going to lead to a national standard of Canada, which is why you see the CSA logo, one of our national standards writing bodies in Canada. We need to play an active role nationally and internationally in creating a global transition taxonomy that's relevant for Canada. And Canada needs to take a position at the ISO tables, which is the global international standardization, and we need to bring our country present and forward about what we're doing and thinking about in Canada. And as I mentioned, why are we doing this? Well, our natural resource economy and society, so it's not just the economy, but society, we're essentially excluded from the existing taxonomies. We need to stand up internationally for our natural resource sector, for the economic, environmental, and social future of this country, because potentially this could be dictated by the Europeans. We have the knowledge in Canada, we have the tools already, we've done this for other sectors, automotive, chemical, we've built national standards around this, and we want to be additive to the existing framework. So we don't want to create something more to confuse the global marketplace. We want to be additive to the existing frameworks that are out there. So this is an example of a green bond framework. This is from RBC. And so this is what a taxonomy is. This is what a green bond is based on. So they list down the left side eligible criteria. In the middle box, they give a description of the activities. And they also link it into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the reason why these taxonomies like this are critical, and there's another one, this is the one that we use at Scotiabank, and they're all very similar. And there's the one from TD Bank as well. So I'm starting to hopefully present a picture that as we start to mobilize global capital using these standardized tools, that we're going to start to see the momentum going into these green and transition activities. And that's how we're going to start to move the global capital and start to move the needle forward on addressing the realities of climate change. And so where I'm going to get to this with resiliency is that we need to make sure that mitigation resiliency is included in these types of taxonomies. And so there are people, we need more people actually, in Canada who are contributing into this. I'll talk a little bit more about the committee that's working on this. But this is where we're going to go with this. We're going to be including things like resiliency into this green and transition taxonomy in Canada, because we have some tremendous thought leadership and research in Canada that we have to be able to bring forward. And we don't have to go further than this room to be able to identify certainly a lot of the work that's being done and the leadership that's being provided around this subject area. So who's doing this? Well, it's the Canadian financial community. You have all of the big 6 banks, you have our pensions, you have major insurance companies, and you have major investors. So you have the federal government, academics, industry associations, natural resource companies, NGOs, all the types of players in Canada that we love to bring together and talk about these things, but we do have a very active initiative. We consciously have chosen not to ask for funding from any level of government, because as we've seen, when elections change, priorities change, and financing can change. So the banks, the pensions, and the insurance companies and the investors, they're funding this. We wanted this to be election-proof. Regardless of what happens either in Ottawa or at any of the provinces, we will continue and we will make sure we get results. So, as I mentioned, we're working through the Canadian Standards Association. In full disclosure, I used to work at Canadian Standards Association, but that was a long time ago. But it's an outstanding organization. It's been around for 100 years. They have been developing standards that are recognized and respected around the world. And they're not the subject matter experts. They don't pretend to be. We bring in the subject matter experts from the banks, the pensions, et cetera, et cetera. But CSA, they bring the international credibility, they bring the framework, and they bring Canada's representation to ISO. So they're a service provider for us to be able to deliver this both within Canada and globally. Early days, we had our first technical committee meeting on October the 3rd, so just last month, and we are still moving ahead with our work, but we still are looking for more groups and organizations to come forward and to make sure that we've got the right representation across the country. So our focus areas, we are developing the transition definition. So what does it mean, transition in Canada? And we've identified 6 sectors, pretty obvious ones, the ones that are heavily dependent or are natural resource sectors: oil and gas, ag, forestry, mass transportation, our primary resources, and the utilities themselves. So these are going to be the focus areas first, that we're going to be building this transition taxonomy and framework for Canada, and we'll be taking this to the international meetings. And the first meeting globally for ISO to start to have these global discussions is next month in China. So our next steps, we're going to finalize the principles and the definition of transition. We have our subgroups and we're starting to populate them, and we're starting to bring in the concept of resiliency. So we've got some members from Insurance Bureau of Canada, Claudia, and we also have from the Intact Centre here at Waterloo. We've got membership from them, but we're certainly open for other organizations. But we've got to be able to find a way that we can tie in the resiliency. So that's how I'm bringing this together. If you remember that framework that I showed earlier from the banks about the different green things, we have to get resiliency and mitigation into those taxonomies, and we will. We're building the international and national connections. We're participating globally in these types of discussions, and we're doing a lot of marketing, outreach, and branding to make sure that the Made in Canada initiative is being understood, and we're raising awareness. We've raised a lot of eyebrows in Europe, and we've also sort of said, we're here, and we're not going away. We will have a place at the table. So within the next 4 to 10 months, we're going to have it finished. We will have our Canadian transition taxonomy for each of the priority sectors by middle of 2020, and that we're going to have clear linkages to the international taxonomies, and that Canada is going to be leading and participating in the international discussions. This might seem like a very fast and speedy process, but we have to do this in terms of we have to be able to get these taxonomies and frameworks because there is so much global interest and liquidity. Global markets are just thirsty for not only green, but they also want to be able to invest in transition because that is how they can have influence, and that is how they can demonstrate how they're bringing financial markets together to address these types of issues and questions. So it is using those global mechanisms and tools. so that we can start to make sure that we're moving, as they've said in the expert panel, to make sustainable finance just everyday plain finance. If you have any questions, we can talk about it during the panel, but there's contact information. I'm the chair of the technical committee, so I'm wearing a bit of a both hat. I have a day job at Scotiabank, but I'm also working at on the CSA project with my colleagues across the Canadian financial community. And if there's any information you'd like or need, or if you're interested in engagement, don't worry, we're not looking for money. We've got all the money that we need. You don't hear that very often, do you? But if you want to bring some money, you're more than welcome. So that's how I've tied together, the concept of we have to get climate resiliency into these Canadian initiatives because we've done some fantastic work and we're continuing to do fantastic work. And the practical reality is that the financial markets are going to be driving a lot of this transition and this movement away from a carbon-intensive society into a much lighter footprint society. It's not going to happen overnight. It does take time. We were a warehouse of natural resources for 400 years. So we're not going to change this overnight, but we have to get, a big ship. We got to change the direction. It takes a little bit of time for that big ship to move. I'll stop there. I think we'll have lots of discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so 3 fantastic presentations, a lot to think about, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Just a reminder, we're actually recording this session. So we have Rebecca, who's going to be our mic runner, and so if you've got a question, put up your hand, but please wait until you actually get, wow, everybody's trigger ready there. Okay, so and just remember to wait until you have the mic before you start asking your questions. So I already see some activity over here, so go for it. Okay, we have one right here.
So while it's certainly encouraging that financial markets and other industries are recognizing the threat of climate change, I believe it's fair to say that for many years it's been recognized scientific consensus, and in some ways it feels like it's taken a bit too long to realize that in the financial markets and other industries. How do you avoid being cynical about what you see insofar as not only inaction, but in some cases negative action toward the goals of climate change, like addressing climate change?
So was that to me?
Just in general, how do you avoid being cynical about this matter?
We could become cynical about many, many topics in our society. And it's always the view of the cup is half full or the cup is half empty. And it's taking that positive approach. And again, I will give a lot of credit to the task force for sustainable, the expert panel for sustainable finance. Because in their document, they say, yes, we could get hung up and depressed and sad and, things are not going well. And there's tremendous risk. But we've got to turn that mindset into the opportunity. And for every risk, there is an opportunity associated with that. So yeah, sometimes you got to get up out of bed in the morning and go, I got to find the positive. I got to find the positive. And so it is those incremental steps, the bit by bit, the small successes, the achievements. And for me, I liken it to even the conversations that you have with individuals, that I have within the bank, that I have with my banking colleagues about the awareness. I've got so many people now sending me articles. Have you seen this? And what about that? And so it's just the awareness is out there. It's every day, like you had mentioned. It's in the media every single day. So it is the awareness. So you soldier on. You find the positive parts, and to me, the glass is half full. We have to keep filling it.
Also, and what I've noticed is that everything used to be siloed off. So you would have the scientific community, you would have the economic community, and you would have government. And now what I'm noticing, especially in the last 5 years or so, that there's a lot more integration of these areas from the scientific community, especially, because usually it was the government and the economy kind of working together, the business community, and the environment was kind of the ugly stepsister, if you want to say. Now that's quite realistically being integrated in. So it's no longer siloed off. So there's hope there that there is momentum on the ground.
I stay optimistic because the alternative is bleak. but really, because we do have time. We still have time. It's an urgent problem, a very difficult problem. If you look at the history of global environmental governance, climate change is a wicked problem. And, but everything we can do to mitigate and prepare will save lives. And so that's why we have to stay engaged with this problem. And I agree that interdisciplinary collaboration has played a big help. Yeah.
This one up here. Oops. Oh. Right at the back row there.
Thanks for some really interesting talks. It's quite stimulating. I'd like to take you back to 1952. I can just remember the smog in London. It was an acrid burning in the back of your throat, and even indoors you could see the haze in front of the light. My dad was upstairs in the front bedroom with advanced TB, hacking his lungs out, and they carted him off to hospital. He survived. 5,000 others didn't. They were premature deaths. And he went on to have 4 major surgeries, and he was in a sanatorium for about 4.5 years, 5 years. Enormously expensive. Wouldn't it have been cheaper if he just died? He didn't. He lived another 20 years. But how do you account for stuff like that? And there might be analogous situations with flood victims and fire victims and so on.
Believe it or not, to get into the morbid details, we do account for lost potential earnings, right? So over 20 years, your father would have made an income. It's possible that the medical outlays for treatment would exceed that. That is possible, but we do actually add all of that up. And it is better to reduce exposures, we find overall. And that's just looking at even if we just look at the economic outlays, like what we'd actually see in terms of lost productivity, which does compound over time, right? And increased medical expenses, even that alone analysis will reveal that a cost-effective climate policy can be paid for just with the air quality health benefits. But you're right, these are population-level risk assessments, right? So individual cases might look different, but we do actually account for all of that, those different effects.
And just kind of going to what you said at the end about flooding, my colleagues are actually, or have worked on the mental health impacts of climate change, specifically in regards to flooding. And what we noticed in our research is that even after a massive flood, it's those, so say a massive rainstorm, people 4 or 5 years later are still, in a sense, traumatized by what you think is just a rainstorm, but their home, which on an average cost would cost an individual $43,000. So every time it rains, and now you're also increasing the severity and how often these storms are happening, the mental health of those who have been impacted by things like flooding or fires is also being intensified.
Okay, I think, yes. Right. Then we'll come over to this side.
Hello. Hi, my name is Yassine. I'm a postdoc in the Faculty of Environment. So I have a question for any of you. So when we're talking about climate change, a key aspect of it, of course, is to look at climate models. And I suppose a lot of information that is used to look at these financial models is from the current generation climate models, right? And later this year or next year, I think we have the next generation coming out. And all these models have quite a range of uncertainty, and maybe they're going to show different characteristics. So my question is, are there any measures that are taken to take into account that range of uncertainty and the changes that might come around from the next generation climate models on the financial requirements and the economy in the future? Because we might see something a little bit different, and which means that the financial model might have to change. So are there measures that are there, and if they're not there yet, to what extent do you think these measures should be put in place? Yeah, thank you.
Sure, maybe I'll start because I have the easiest answer to that, which is we run climate models, we run Earth system models ourselves, and are very conscious and aware of intermodal uncertainty, natural variability, all of these sources. Wherever we can, our approach is to throw as much data as we can, and so those numbers you see are averages of hundreds of simulations for different scenarios, and that's how we any uncertainty that's reducible through multiple simulations or large ensembles, we'll take advantage of that.
So on one of my slides for our institute itself, we focus on a lot of insurance-related information, so not necessarily climate. We do obviously do our research and have research in that, but we focus on the insurance claims as that is tangible and almost in real time. We can get that information back quite quickly. And on the graph that I showed with the increasing intensity of climate change, but also the costs that are associated to it, I made the comment that it's government's budget that are being impacted. What we also need to take into consideration is in 2008 in the United States, now their economy is much larger than ours and it has a much larger impact on the global economy. But for Canada specifically, if you're looking at what happened in 2008, it was actually the mortgage market that crashed that caused the recession. So utilizing this information, what we're looking at is saying, okay, insurance costs are increasing because of increasing severe weather. So you have a 20 to 25% increase in premiums. Also, your insurance caps, so your basement is covered for a certain amount of money. Those caps are being lowered. So I had said that the insurance, the average cost of a basement is $43,000. Caps are $10,000 to $20,000 now. That means that you, as a homeowner, could be on the line for approximately $33,000. Now use this stat. Two out of 3 Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. If you have a flood on Monday, mostly it's due to sewer backup. By Wednesday, you need that water out of your house. If you're on the line for $33,000 and are only living paycheck to paycheck, how do you get that water out? So now what we start using that analysis for is thinking into the future of, okay, now people are going to start defaulting on their mortgages, on their loans, on things like that. So that's where the credit rating agencies, the mortgages, Mortgage Board of Canada comes on board. And then we start saying, what could this do to the economy within Canada itself? And so we use information like that.
Okay.
If I could just throw in one point, if there's one thing banks love models. Whew. We have teams and teams of modeling. But from the climate change perspective, excellent question and very timely. So each of the banks has their own climate models that they're using internally. We are collectively, as a banking community, through the Canadian Banking Association, looking to have that standardized so that we've got a consistent set. And the Bank of Canada is also considering a standardized set of climate change risk models for the banking community, because the banks are highly, highly regulated by the Bank of Canada and a few other federal agencies. So the same way that the Bank of Canada has issues the stress testing models that are used every month, and you'll hear how people's consumer indexes and all those things and all the things that the banks like to report on is based on models coming from the federal government and Bank of Canada. So they're having those discussions right now as well. So hot topic, great question.
Okay, question over here.
Thank you. I have several questions, but I'll hold off. The first question, I guess, for both Peter and Katherine, both of you mentioned the TCFD and our very own Mark Carney to go with it. I was wondering what your take on transitionary risk was, in particular stranded asset risk, whether you think it's a viable consequence in your investment decisions, and sort of the cascading effects associated with stranded asset risks through supply chains.
Well, simply to say that it is a risk and it has to be accounted for, and stranded assets are a legitimate risk that are out there. So they need to be accounted for and taken into the risk models and into the lending decisions or whatever decisions had to be made. But yes, that is a risk.
Speaking along the lines of transition risk, part of our report, actually, we've calculated, as I had said, impacts on share price, but we went further into impacts the risk associated, not only transitionary risk, but the moment you disclose, there's actually risk associated with that. We were able to produce a calculation, so that will, I'll pass it on to you once it's released in December, but we were actually able to put a value to the moment a company discloses. They're saying that we are at risk for this to happen, so they're kind of opening the doors for people to see. So not only are you going from gray assets to what I call olive assets to green assets, the moment I disclose my risk and then start transitioning my corporation either by integrating mitigation measures and adapting to this, or ultimately the transition, all of that along the lines is going to cause risk. But the whole idea is if we start beginning to disclose it, I'm opening the doors. For you not opening the doors, you're going to lose assets because people aren't going to, and I'm very careful in the way I say it, but more or less people aren't going to trust why you're not disclosing. Is it immaterial or are you trying to hide something?
Okay. Right here.
Thank you. Michael Drescher, Faculty of Environment. I am interested in what you said, how that connects with municipal operations, because what you have talked about a lot about is, of course, industry. A lot of that is affected by federal actions, but a lot of actions that we see nowadays when there's a power vacuum because governments don't take action is at the municipal level, that municipal governments are pushing forward, but that needs to be financed. For example, I know the city of Brampton has a new goal of being greenhouse gas emissions neutral by 2050, which means that the entire housing stock needs to be renovated. How is this going to be financed?
Well, I can't answer specifically for that municipality, but if you look across the landscape in Canada and in other jurisdictions around the world, but in Canada, you see a very large number of green bonds that have been issued by municipalities. I believe also the province of Ontario just issued another green bond earlier this week. So you have, City of Toronto's issued them, Ottawa's issued them, Vancouver. So they are using the existing financial instruments that they often will use for their traditional financing, such as going to the bond market, but we see a very strong trend for them to start to move into the green. So they're in the green bond market already. Many have been in there for a long time and have, fantastic taxonomies and frameworks. They've put a lot of effort and thought into them, and hopefully they'll start to pick up on this transition concept as well and start to build that into their models. But the municipalities are really doing a lot of leading edge work about leveraging their financial instruments through green bonds.
Also, speaking from a municipality level, my colleagues who are here today, we work within the municipalities, and we need to mitigate climate change and CO2 in the atmosphere and greenhouse gases. But mitigation takes up about 90 to 95% of the rhetoric in the public and in the media. We need to also start discussing adaptation. And so my colleagues focus on adaptation. And to put this into perspective, if municipalities start beginning adapting and changing the way that more natural infrastructure, 73 to 75% of natural infrastructure across Canada has been removed. These are natural sponges, so when massive flooding events happen, that's a natural infrastructure to take that water in. What my colleagues have been focusing on is if we begin adapting our municipalities, if you invest $1 into adaptation, that is $3 to $8 in savings in the long run. So the inaction, what we are trying to show is that there is financial benefit for understanding that climate change is happening, but also adapting our societies to say, okay, well, how do we new or existing developments, how do we do incorporate adaptation into that?
Okay, there was one up here, just, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to ask for any of your thoughts on the divestment movement, which speaks to divesting from fossil fuel funds, especially as Canadian universities are starting to take the lead and divest their own funds.
Another hot topic, and it is going to continue, and it's not, I would say, just the university funds. You know, it's the discussion of pensions. It's, you know, anyone who has a fiduciary duty and responsibility to manage funds needs to be thinking about these things. And the context that, you know, we provide and that we think about is, you know, you have a choice. You can either be divesting and stepping away from conversations, or you can remain invested and you can engage with the companies and the organizations to voice your concerns and start to guide them in a different direction. So it's a question of whether you want to be in the conversation and in the tent and part of the process, or whether you would like to step away. Or the other third option that's starting to emerge is to really channel your funds, you know, and you can move it into specifically the types of businesses or funds that are more reflective of your desires and your intentions. So there's kind of three steps to this. There's the divestment, there's the remaining and engaging and influencing, and then that third one is to be very specific or more focused in your investment.
We're also going to need to be innovative. At this moment, the International Energy Agency just came out with recent stats, and as much as we're trying to push for renewables and energy efficiency, we are a society that is based on a 30-30-30. So coal, oil, petroleum, and natural gas. These are all fossil fuel-based resources. And based on population growth, the stat is basically 11,000 people per hour. That will ultimately mean 80 to 90 million people additional, that's deaths minus births, per year, and by 2030, 2035, that's an additional 1.2 billion people on this planet. So we need innovative solutions. We need mitigation measures to really start pushing that innovation forward, because unless that happens, we are still going to remain a 30-30-30 economy. And as much as people don't like to hear that, because we have all of these goals to meet, they're going to be very difficult to reach without innovation.
I guess I'll just say, you know, the natural incentives in fighting climate change are all not for the societal benefit, right? So anything we can do to align private incentives with the social ones would be a good thing. And I think having additional information for investors about like which instruments are trying to align with their personal goals is one way to vote with your dollars. And that's all I'll say about that.
Okay, I think we have time. Oh, sorry. Do you have something more to add? Oh, I wasn't sure. We have time for one last question. Okay, yep. Over here.
Hi. So Canada is moving on climate change, perhaps way too slowly, but we're moving. In the meantime, our largest trading partner is down-regulating in a pretty visible way. I wonder if that's because the business community has more influence than the financial community, in a sense, because it seems to me that the case that you guys are making is that it should be completely evident to anybody in the financial community that collective action is required for the health of a national economy. And so I wonder if there's some sort of communication gap here.
There is certainly differences of what's going on between Canada and the United States. Although the U.S., although federally they, you know, are stepping away from the Paris Accord, there is a lot of innovative activities that is going on at the state level and at the municipal levels. So I think we have to be careful about our lens that we use. You know, there's a lot of good local stuff, but perhaps it's a little murky or cloudy at the top. And I am a believer that you need to have the right environment of a combination of the markets and economic policy and government policy, regulatory. You need to try and have all of those things headed in the right direction and firing on all cylinders in order to be able to achieve those things. We'll wait and see how this new government is going to move out, but it looks as if we could have an important cylinder firing there. We definitely have the markets that are moving in that, and I think that society is desperately looking for solutions and a path forward. But we also have the realities that we're a natural resource-based country, and we've got very strong regional differences that have to be addressed through governments, et cetera. So we have very, very strong optimism and possibility here in Canada with this new government going forward. So I think we can get all of these necessary cylinders firing in Canada in a very short time.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Great discussion. Thank you so much to our speakers, Katherine, Rebecca, and Peter. Thank you again.